Okay, welcome everybody for our next webinar about unified performance management and the best practices which are included in this framework. The next stop is top-down and bottom-up planning, and more specifically, we will talk about the link of strategies and operational activities today, and then also we give you a live example how companies can define top-down targets and model them also bottom up in one central application. Before we dive into this, I would like to mention that it's an Apliqo webinar series which we hosted or started to host last year in June, and we have done already quite a lot of webinars about different kind of best practices. KPI analytics, workforce planning, driver-based planning, scenario modeling. And this webinar is now the first one for 2019, top-down and bottom-up planning. And during the next weeks and months, more will come. And in the with the two URL links you see above, there are options to sign up for the future webinars. And also the second link shows you all the recorded webinars which we have hosted in the last year, so that you always have the chance to recap this and come back to us with potential questions. For today's webinar, I would like to quickly share the flow due to the fact that we always have a good mix of people who joined already previous webinars and also new people. We would always like to quickly start to give you some background information about Apliqo, KPIs, and the UPM framework, how we understand unified performance management. Then we will dive into the business planning challenges, common challenges we see in the market around planning, and give you some definition about top-down and bottom-up planning and where we see the pros and the cons of each planning methodology. And then a big part of the webinar is always a live demo, so that you get a feeling of how this can then be executed in a live application. And last but not least, a summary and some key takeaways enclosed with some question and answer sessions. So first of all, to give you some background information, Apliqo is a KPIs company, and KPIs is a consulting company and software company who is focusing on performance management solutions, reporting and planning solutions for different kind of companies, and with an absolutely focus on a technology called TM1 planning analytics. In this area, we are almost offering the full stack to the market. We have a dedicated development and support team, and we are an IBM Platinum business partner. We have an own KPIs education department where we train people in the specific TM1 planning analytics technology with own training programs, with our own client days and user conference, which we host every year around the globe. We have an own KPIs code department, which develops own software tools for the TM1 planning analytics community to make the different kind of applications more stable and give more advantage for the companies. And then last but not least, the topic for today is Apliqo product, which is a pre-built reporting and planning application based on the TM1 technology, which allows companies to use a pre-built framework and use a different kind of best practices around FP&A. The whole product is a so-called unified performance management suite. A lot of companies are talking about corporate performance management, enterprise performance management, integrated business planning. When KPIs talks about unified performance management, we always talk about the integration of strategic, financial, and operational plans in an organization. And the whole UPM suite is covering the different parts of this. It means the full stack of a reporting and planning cycle in an organization. There is strategic performance management application to define strategic targets and strategic activities. There is a financial performance management application which covers the whole financial core model, being P&L, balance sheet, and cash flow statement. And from a reporting and planning point of view, there is an operational performance management which covers the whole operational layer, like revenue planning, marketing, workforce planning, CapEx planning, and so on and so forth. And then last but not least, there is also a full consolidation and close application, which supports companies in the audit process during the year. It's a unified view. That's the reason why it's called Unified Performance Management. So in the center of the whole application is always the financial core model, a pre-built model. And then around this, you have the different kind of operational models. And there is already a pre-built connection between each model, so that at any time when you do something from a planning point of view in one area, it will be automatically reflected in the other area. Means if you change something from the marketing HR point of view, it will be immediately impacting the figures and the lines in the P&L statement, and then obviously also the movements in the balance sheet and the cash flow statement. So this allows really people to do integrated and connected and unified planning. So if we come to the business planning process in a lot of companies and the challenges we see in this area, there are different kind of hurdles. I think in most of the organizations, planning plays an important role, but a lot of people in the organization are not very happy with the whole process. And the main challenges are or can be classified into different areas. First of all, for a lot of companies, it takes a lot of time to really execute and finalize the whole budget and planning process. There are certain companies where the budget process takes 3 to 6 months, and it's a big burden for the whole organization. Even if the time is so high, the quality or the outcome of the budget quality is quite often very weak, and there are multiple reasons for this. And also due to the fact that it takes so long time, and in a lot of organizations the process is very detailed, a lot of resources are bundled in this process, and they have to spend a lot of time, and they get sidetracked from a lot of important operational tasks during this time. Then if we take all this together, high time, low quality, and a lot of resources who are focused on this process, the total cost of ownership in a lot of organizations is extremely high, which is a big disadvantage for a lot of companies. And one reason for this is the difficulty for a lot of companies to find the balance of the right planning detail. There is also always an ongoing discussion how detailed you need to plan. Do you need to plan on each customer, on each product SKU level? Do you have the ability to plan on a higher level? Do you need to plan top down or bottom up? And this is a constant challenge in a lot of organizations, and it's quite often also driven based on missing technology who allows for both during the whole planning cycle. There is also quite often a lack of ownership. Quite often the whole planning process is heavily driven from the finance department, but when it really comes to an integrated planning and you want to bring also other operational planning layers which may currently sit in an Excel environment and are not part of an integrated application, you also need to involve other departments, and you need to define department or leads, planning leads in the different departments who take over the ownership and the responsibility to really drive this process and to make the integration and the different planning methodologies happen. And only if you do this, there you can really do the integration of the plans. But due to the fact that in a lot of companies, not the important planners of the different departments are fully involved into this process, a lot of companies are also facing challenges around the whole integration of the overall plans of the organization. So these are the let's say, the main challenges which we see in the market around business planning. Obviously, there are a lot of more challenges, but I think it summarize it quite well about the key challenges. Then if we talk a bit more from a definition point of view, characteristics and pros and cons of the top-down and bottom-up approach, before we dive into the demo, we can classify it into different areas. If we say from a top-down point of view, quite often the top management really leads the process. So there is a small team typically, quite often driven again from the finance department, who are leading the whole top-down planning process. But it's also quite important that the team needs a certain expertise and about the industry. They need to have industry knowledge, because quite often also market share information and stuff like this is taken into consideration. And they really need to have a deep understanding of the company and of the different areas and business units of the company. Due to the fact that the process is always on a higher level and is not going so deep into detail, it's quite often a fast and a flexible approach, because quite often you may do the revenue, gross margin, OPEX planning on a higher level, means business unit level and or company level, and so on and so forth. Therefore, you can streamline this process, and it's quite often a lot of organizations fast and flexible. And it's one character is also the high level estimation. So you really don't go into detail on a product level, on a customer or channel level, and so on. So the management really pushes down the data to the lower management level. So they really set targets. And this comes with certain pros and then certain cons. Obviously, if we focus on the pros, on the one hand, quite often the top management is a bit more strategic focused. So they have, due to the fact that they are not so deep into the operational day-to-day business, they have more the big pictures from time to time. And they can also, due to the fact that it's more a high-level approach, they can come back with a fast outcome and with typically a stable plan, which is quite flexible. So due to the fact that the level of detail is not so high, there is always the ability to adapt the plans if a new situation happens, and then to generate different kind of scenarios of the plans. And another pro of the whole top-down approach is that it's good for a target setting, so that you can define targets for different parts of your business and then break these targets down to the operational managers of the organization. But there are also some cons in the top-down planning. Quite often what we see is that the management misses operational details, maybe important information about supplier availability or product availability, about current sales order situation, backlog situations, issues with product life cycles or product development. Very important operational information are from time to time missed in the top-down planning. So that can be then an issue when it comes to the discussion how accurate and how achievable is such a top-down target. Then, due to the fact that it's done from a small team, we see quite often that there is a lack of involvement and a lack of ownership from the operational managers, because they were not 100% involved or not at all involved into the top-down plan. And if this is the case, we see quite often that there is really a missing link between the top-down and the bottom-up plan. The missing link is also quite often driven from the fact that a lot of companies are facing challenges to do and execute a top-down and a bottom-up plan in the same application and make the transparency of both figures available to the whole team. And then, due to the fact that it's from time to time high level and sometimes important operational information is missing, sometimes there is a risk that the targets are potentially unrealistic in certain areas. So the same from a bottom-up point of view. There are typical multiple management levels are involved. different kind of department owners, and the planning is much more detailed. So obviously, there are also different level of details, and the different level of details are really depending on the business dimensions, your key business dimensions, and for example, the chart of account line items, how detailed you really want to plan. For example, you can plan from a product level point of view, really on SKU level, or the application gives you the ability to plan on consolidated levels of the product dimension, for example, or a channel or a customer dimension. This level of detail really needs to be defined on a case-by-case basis per company. But typically, the bottom-up is a longer process with multiple iterations. It's never the case that you finalize the budget after the first run. There are multiple iterations in each organization. And what we see, there are multiple options to plan a bottom-up approach. You really can do it on a cost item level. You can do it on a higher level of the chart of account dimension. You can do it based on a driver-based approach. You can do it based on a zero-based budgeting approach. There are a lot of FP&A best practices how you can do a detailed bottom-up plan. And obviously, there are certain best practices which allows you really to streamline the whole bottom-up approach. For example, driver-based planning, which was also one of the topics on our previous webinars. And then typically the outcome is really generated up to the chain of command. But this comes also with pros and cons. From pros, typically you have more ownership and responsibility. You have a higher transparency of the data because you do it on a more detailed level, and you take order information into account. You take maybe issues with production capacities in account, and so you really have more transparency. And what you typically also have, if the operational managers are doing the budget bottom up, you have a bigger commitment, and from time to time a higher accuracy. But also this can goes into one or another direction. What we see, if you do the bottom-up approach too detailed, then a lot of organizations are really getting lost in the detail, and this is really counterproductive from a forecast accuracy point of view. And quite often, it is the basic for resource allocations. If you do a more detailed bottom-up plan on a cost center, on a business unit level, on a product level, and so on, it gives you then enough information to do the resource allocation from a production capacity point of view, from an HR planning point of view. So this is definitely an advantage of the bottom-up plan. But there is a risk always, I think everybody knows this, that the organization tends to do to plan the revenue a bit lowballing and the cost a bit highballing. So you need to manage this. Quite often also the politics drives the budget allocation because more people are involved, and every department owner is driving for more budget in certain areas. It's a bigger workload to really reconcile the data with the targets. But again, this is also quite often driven because a lot of companies are really having challenges to have the top-down and a bottom-up plan in one central application embedded. There is risk of getting lost in details. This is something what I mentioned already before. And typically, if you don't use the right best practices, the bottom-up approach can be really time intense. So this was a quick overview about the characteristics of each planning approach and the pros and cons. And from our point of view, and we will discuss this a bit more in detail at the end of the demo when we talk about the summary and the key takeaways, there is no good or bad for both methodologies. Both has pros and cons. Our point of view is that companies need to find a way to combine both versions in an application. And on a case-by-case situation, you really need to define how detailed you want to go with the bottom-up approach, and then how high level you want to do the top-down planning approach. But you need to bring both planning methodologies and the values which are generated out of it you need to bring them together and reconcile the data in a central application. Good. Enough PowerPoint. So I would like to switch now to the live demo to give you an example how this can be executed in an application. So I will switch now. Okay. So now we have the entry screen of the top-down and bottom-up planning application. As you see here, we are using a front end which is part of each Apliqo UPM application, which is called the Apliqo UX. It's a modern web front end due to the fact that Apliqo is based on the IBM TM1 Planning Analytics Station technology. You obviously have also all other kind of user interfaces, but this user interface allows really companies to build guided planning and reporting applications. Yeah, as you will see in a second, you can really give the users a guided approach to go through the whole process. On the top of the screen, you see the flow of the top-down target setting and the bottom-up planning. So at the starting point, really have the top-down setup where you can define the parameters and define default top-down planning methods. The second step is top-down planning in itself, so that based on the default parameters, you have the ability then to override certain forecast methods and target values, and then do it for the different kind of plan types, being revenue, expenses, and or balance sheet. Then you have obviously the calculation which kicks in, which I show you later. And then at the next step, you have the bottom-up planning, so that the top-down targets are getting pushed down to the lower levels. And then in a second planning layer, you have the ability to really plan the data bottom-up based on the top-down targets which were pushed down. And then obviously, last but not least, you always need to reconcile both. So you need to have the transparency in such an application to see what was the top-down target on different kind of business dimension levels, and what was then generated bottom-up from the operational manager, so that you can reconcile and track the values and start the communication and iteration process. So if we start with a top-down setup, the first step is really to define the default parameters. You see here, this can be done from a central planning team. You define the budget years, year which is 2018 in this case. You have predefined parameters for different kind of planning types. In this demo, we talk now about the revenue planning, about the expense planning, and about the balance sheet planning. And for each planning type, you can define, for the top-down version, which you see here, you can define pre or default forecast methods, being full year budget plus X%. And I will show you more forecast methods later, so that you get a feeling about the pre-built forecast methods which are part of the application. You have then different kind of phasing methods which you can choose as default parameters. You have this for revenue. You can choose different one for the whole expense planning part of your top-down target setting process. And then also from a balance sheet point of view, you can also define the forecast method and the phasing method. And then to give you an example of the drivers or forecast methods which are part, you can define for each balance sheet item, for example, being accounts receivable, payables, inventory. There are multiple forecast methodologies which can be selected and can be chosen then for as default parameter set for the top-down target setting. So the next step is, after the default parameters were done, the next step is then really to define the approval hierarchy. The whole Apliqo product or UPM suite is working after the concept of so-called fixed business dimensions and generic business dimensions. The fixed business dimension is, for example, a company, a version, a currency, a chart of account, and so on. Means dimensions which typically every organization needs to fulfill a specific plan in a certain area of the company. And then we have also so-called generic business dimensions, which are the FIN BSEC 1, FIN BSEC 2, and 3. And these dimensions can be populated from each company with key business dimensions, which is driving the plan type of the organization. From a revenue point of view, it can be, for example, a product, a customer, a channel, a business unit, and so on and so forth. From an expense point of view, it can be a cost center, a profit center, or whatever kind of business dimension is really driving your expenses in the organization. And then from a balance sheet point of view, quite often it's the company or each individual company level, or maybe you have also a business unit or a profit center level where you have the ability to produce balance sheet information or full balance sheet. So the approval hierarchy defines on a plan type what is the key approval hierarchy, means on which business dimension I can really break down my top-down targets from a forecast methodology point of view, and then also my top-down targets from a business value point of view. For revenue, we have chosen here the FIN BSEC 3 plan, which is in this demo environment the product dimension, and you will see it later in a second. And then from an expense point of view, we have chosen for the FIN BSEC 1 plan, we have chosen the cost center as the approval hierarchy. So this can be defined in the second step. In the third step, I want to give you a quick overview about the different kind of forecast methodologies and the ability to define for each forecast methodology to define if this methodology is allowed for a planner as an input value, because the application comes with a lot of predefined forecast methodologies like full year estimate, full year budget, 6 months run rate, 3 months run rate. For all the balance sheet information, you have per accounts receivable different kind of forecast methodologies, and especially for the top-down planning, not each forecast methodology is really relevant, because quite often in the top-down planning you plan based on percentage rates, so you can define the different methodologies as true or keep it blank. So for every methodology which you keep blank means that this methodology is not popping up in any pick list for a top-down planner, for example, so that again the planner is really guided through the application and doesn't need to choose between hundreds of different elements for the planning process, so that you really can streamline the process. The next one is then the default methods. It gives you an overview. You see here the default method is coming and automatically populated from the default parameters which we have set before. From a revenue point of view, we have defined that the default parameter is the full year budget plus X. We have defined that the phasing method is the even phasing as default. And then I have the ability to enter here also the default input value, so that I can, for example, decide that for all the accounts which are part of the revenue, or more likely of the gross profit of the business, I can define default input values, which will be automatically broken down to the lower levels of the business dimensions, which is part of your planning application. And the business dimension, which we are talking here about now, is currently the company level. We have the cost center dimension. We have a region dimension, which is a breakdown by region and by country. We have a customer dimension, and we have also the product dimension. So you can really define top down on a chart of account level. You can define the default forecast methodology and the phasing methodology, and then the default value, and automatically these values and these drivers are pushed down to the lower levels. And then obviously, and this is what we will see in a later step, the calculation kicks in based on the default methods and values which you are maintaining here. So this is the first step. In the next step is obviously you need to have the ability to override, because if you have a top-down target plan and you have different kind of business dimensions, it's obvious that you cannot plan with a flat percentage rate or with one forecast methodology the whole organization. You may want to set different growing targets by business unit, by product. You want to set different expense targets on a cost center level or on a company level. Therefore, a best practice application needs to take this into consideration, so that based on the default parameter setting, you have the ability to really override the information and to plan it on different kind of levels. So if we do this with an example from a sales and cost of goods sold point of view, in the application I have then the ability to break down my, for example, my revenue top-down target, break it down on a product level. So I have immediately now the data which were pushed down from as a default value. I have still my full year budget and my percentage rate here, but then I have the ability to override. You see with the method override, the phasing override, and the input override, I have the ability to set different kind of targets for the different kind of areas of the business. In this case, the combination of revenue and product. So if I override the forecast method here, I will delete it once so that you get an understanding of it. If I delete the override, you see that the full year budget plus X from the default parameter kicks in. But if I plan then or override the methodology on a specific product level, in this case core brands, and underneath of the core brands I have the Ray-Ban consolidated level and then the individual SKUs, you see that the method will be overridden, so that for the top-down plan for all the core products is now taking the full year estimate plus X into consideration. And then also from a value point of view, I have the ability to override the input value of growth rate of 35%, and I can override it just for this specific product combination and put in 45%, and it will automatically break down the targets on the lower levels or on the lowest level of the product dimension. And I can do this really in the combination of a different kind of products. I can do it, for example, as well for the luxury brands, where I say the original default target of 40% is not really sustainable. Therefore, I want to plan for all core products just a 30% with a different forecast methodologies. And as you see, the data will be, or the targets will be pushed down automatically down to the lowest level of this element. So I really can use the application to define high-level targets and then push down the targets and override the targets for certain parts of the business. And I can do this in the combination of the total group, so the consolidated results, and then push it down to every legal entity. So if I go down now to a specific legal entity, I see that the full year estimate and the 45 input value, which I have overwritten on a group level, is automatically populated also to the company level. But for example, if I have a different target for this specific company, this specific region, or whatever kind of business dimension, I still can override it on this level of detail, so that I may want to choose here my 6 months run rate. You see that then for the combination of the Ray-Ban product and this specific legal entity, the data will be overwritten. But if I then jump back to another entity, you see that the 6 months run rate is not given or populated to another entity, because it was specifically set as target for the combination of this legal entity and this product group. So you really have the flexibility to define the targets on different kind of levels, and based on this you can then really define targets and push it down to lower levels. The same logic applies obviously for all the other accounts here. For example, for the cost of goods sold, we have decided to plan the data on a different forecast methodology, because we want to plan all the products in percentage of revenue, so that I can simulate the gross margin or the product margin for specific product groups. So I have selected this driver as a override driver, and then I can also populate and model here different kind of COGS in percent of revenue for different kind of product groups. So for example, if the top-down target should reflect a better margin in the luxury products, because the strategic target is to renegotiate the price terms with the suppliers, it can be perfectly modeled here from a top-down point of view. So the full flexibility to set default targets and then push it down and override it to lower levels of the organization, and break it then down and set different targets for different business dimension combinations. This works in the same way then for expenses. But if you remember, we have done or we have set as approval hierarchy the business dimension. So I have here now the ability to drill down on a cost center level, so that I can do exactly in the same way like I have done with the product revenue and the product cost of goods sold. I can apply exactly the same functionality for all my operational expenses. As a starting point, I have the default method and the default value, which kicks in the full year budget plus X% and the value. But then on each chart of account line item, in this case the salary, I can override the forecast method, because maybe from a top-down point of view, the company went through a restructuring process, and the last 3 months salary expenses are reflecting the current team structure, which is relevant for the next 12 months. And therefore, I can take the forecast methodology 3 months run rate plus a certain percentage rate. And in this area, it's maybe more relevant than the generic driver, which were set before. And then also from a marketing point of view, I can decide to define different kind of targets, because I want to have a high revenue growth, which I have predicted, and I want to allow the business to spend more money in certain areas to really support the revenue growth of the organization. So I really have the ability to override the data in this area, and then as you see, it kicks in, and then the default or the final value will then be used for the whole modeling of the top-down data in the target setting process. So this is from an expense point of view, and then obviously also from a balance sheet point of view, you have there also the availability to set targets for example, the net working capital, which is quite often the most relevant balance sheet line items to model net working capital and optimize net working capital. And here you can as well, we have defined as approval hierarchy the company. So you can really break down the top-down target on a company level, and you can set different targets based on different kind of forecast methodologies per net working capital item for the organization, and then by company and or by business unit, so that you really can push it down. When this is done, and the target setting is done, then obviously you need to have an application which calculates the data on the fly. So you need to have the calculation logic in the background so that the default parameters and the default and or overwritten values or parameters are pushed down, and then you need to have the model in the background that the data will be calculated. And this is what we see here now in the next steps. You have first of all to use all these different kind of forecast methodologies like full year estimate, full year budget plus X%, 6 months run rate, and so on and so forth. You need to have reference values in your application. So you need to load also historical data or actual data like prior year, current year budget information. You need to have a calculation where constantly on a monthly base, the 3 months run rate will be calculated. So you need to have this kind of elements calculated in the application to apply then the forecast methodologies. So when you have this, you see then that the data or the drivers and the values which I have entered and set in the previous steps are pushed down, and the calculation logic kicks in. So I have now the overwritten phasing methodology of full year estimate plus X% and the 45% for Ray-Ban, which we have pushed down. I have the 30% and the full year estimate for all the luxury brands, which is pushed down, and the calculation is done on the fly. And then I have also for the premium brands, I haven't changed the forecast methodology, and I haven't changed the values, but the calculation is done. So just to simulate this for the premium brands and the 4.7 round about 500,000 revenue target in this area, if I go back to the premium brands from a revenue point of view, and then override the value here to 50, for example, you see that it's getting pushed down. And then I go back to the revenue tab, and I immediately see that the 50 is taken into consideration here, and the value is getting calculated on the fly, so that I have a new top-down target based on the default parameters or the overwritten parameter which I have entered in. So the same applies, and this is now for the combination of a specific legal entity and the revenue account and a specific country. Obviously, I have the same logic then for all the other chart of account elements. So if I go on the cost of goods sold, I see that my in percent of revenue is taken into consideration. This is a forecast methodology which I have overwritten, and then also again all the values which I have entered, which is reflecting the gross margin on a product level, is taken into consideration, and the data will be calculated and the results will be calculated on the fly, so that at any time I have the full transparency about the total revenue and COGS and gross margin. As you see here, I also have the total of the gross margin available, so that the top management can also really use this tool, this central tool, as a target setting tool, and reconcile and quantify the data against reference values from prior years or current year or latest estimate information. So this is fully calculated based on the targets we have set. The same for the top-down expenses, where you have the ability then to break it down in the same way. If we, for example, go to the marketing element and then do a breakdown by cost center and break this down, we see that in a specific legal entity, we immediately see that the 8%, where from a top-down point of view, I have said, okay, we have now a strong revenue growth, which we set as a target, and I want to give the department manager the ability to spend a bit more money to support it. It will also automatically push down so that you really can simulate and reflect different targets in a certain area. In this case, a higher gross profit based on big revenue growth and maybe more attractive margins. You can also allow and set targets for a higher spend to really support this maybe aggressive revenue growth and margin growth concept. So this is the logic how the top-down target setting works, and the on-the-fly calculation of the top-down target values for the whole P&L, and then obviously also for the balance sheet of the organization. The next one is then the bottom-up planning. Here it's quite important that in the central application you have the ability to show both at the same time. You have here again all the reference values which are important to calculate the data on the fly. You have a variance calculation of top-down versus working budget, which is representing the bottom-up approach here. You have the working budget, which can be modeled now from the operational managers based on the top-down targets, and then you have the top-down targets, which we have modeled in the step before. So an operational manager gets now the top-down targets from the top management. They have the full visibility about how the top management was generating the values, because they see the plan method and they see the input value and the calculated value. The top management has also the ability to add here narrative, so that they can give a bit information of why they have chosen this kind of target setting. And then in the same screen, the operational managers have the ability to come up with their plan. You see, as a starting point, the top-down targets were copied into the bottom-up version as a starting point, as a basic point. And now the operational managers can go into the application and model the business data based on their operational knowledge. So they can be more aggressive, for example, for the core brands. They can say that for all the luxury brands, it's absolutely unrealistic that we have such a revenue growth in this specific entity and in this country. And they can add here narrative that not realistic because of whatever. They can really add here narrative, so that on the one hand, the top management and the operational managers have really the ability to collaborate and communicate via the application, so that they are not just receiving a number, they are getting also the background behind the number, so that they have the full visibility about it, and that they always have the full transparency about the data or the variances, and also the different drivers they have chosen in the bottom-up plan and in the top-down plan. So you really have the full visibility. You can model the data from a bottom-up point of view with different values and with different drivers, and you have the full visibility of the drivers and input values which were chosen really from the top-down target. You can do this from a revenue point of view, and then obviously also same logic applies from an expense point of view, just with a different kind of dimensionality. So you would select then the salary, for example. It was chosen here the 3 months run rate in the top-down plan. It was copied as a default value into the bottom-up plan, but then the operational managers can decide when the 3 months run rate were maybe not realistic. Therefore, we need to increase this slightly because we have already a lot of new people in the pipeline where we are in negotiation, or they may have already signed a contract. So they really can model it differently, and I have then immediately the impact and the delta impact between the bottom up and the and the top-down target which were set from the management. So before we jump into the review process, I would quickly like to share our view of how this all ties together. And it is really for us, these are different kind of approaches. For us, it's two different kind of planning approaches with different perspectives. And as you know, I'm based in Switzerland. Currently, the season starts, and therefore, I think these two pictures are explaining it maybe a bit better. You have different perspectives and different approaches. You have there people who are doing the top-down planning, and for them in this situation, they really want to. They have nice weather. They need to create a plan to come down fast down the mountain. They need to be flexible because maybe the weather conditions change. So they really need, or there is a certain urgency and a certain speed in the top-down planning to produce the numbers, and in this case to go down to the mountain and then maybe enjoying the après-ski. And then from a bottom-up point of view, as you see, there are more people involved. It's still a long way until they are top of the mountain. There are a lot of hurdles, a lot of challenges which they may face until they are top of the mountain. But the key message here is they are all in the same boat, because the people who are on top of the mountains, they had the way up before they can go down. And therefore, it's really not this situation of there is the good approach and the bad approach. All the people in the organization are in the same boat, and you need to find a way with the right technology to combine both methodologies and to give the company the ability to model both, reconcile both, and based on this then to define operational activities and the next steps in the planning cycle. So I think this is quite important. So if we quickly go back to the review screen, and it's all fine, but you also need to give the management the ability to really review the data. But we have not changed now a lot of data in this example. Therefore, maybe a waterfall chart looks a little bit different than if you really do it changes on different kind of business dimensions. But the key message here is you have a full visibility about, in this case, the profit and loss. You have the top-down plan, which was calculated on the fly based on the targets and the values. You have the budget scenario, or in this case, the bottom-up plan, which was really calculated based on the drivers which were chosen on the lowest level and the values which were chosen. And then you have the delta calculation really on each line item of the chart of account, so that you can really analyze it from different angles. And obviously you can analyze, this is now an example for one entity, but obviously you can analyze it on cost center level, on entity level, on business unit level, and so on and so forth. And then also the waterfall chart, which explains to you on the one hand an EBITDA waterfall, the top-down target, and then also the bottom-up values which were generated based on the bottom-up plan. And then you have the waterfall really by each line item of the P&L, being revenue, cost of goods sold, and then all the other different OPEX line items. And then from a gross margin point of view, you have a different kind of dimensionality. For example, you have here a waterfall chart, top down versus bottom up, based on product and for revenue. But you can obviously here also select then the cost of goods sold or the gross profit information. So you have immediately the full transparency about differences between both planning approaches. And then from where are they coming from a product point of view. And then here as an example, you see the same logic or the same waterfall chart based on region or country dimensionality. So really the key business dimensions are driving the waterfall chart, but the key message here is you need to have the full transparency about the differences, and then you need to have the breakdown of the differences by the different key business dimensions which are driving the results in your organization. Okay, this was the live demo. of the top-down, bottom-up plan and how you can bring them together in a central application. And the last slide is really to give you a quick summary about the summary and the key takeaways and how you can best align the two planning approaches. So first of all, as I said earlier, there is no good or no bad. Both methodologies has pros and cons, but the key is to identify on a case by case what is really needed in your organization and what level of detail you really need for both planning methodologies. You can combine both, as you have seen before, but obviously you need to have a technology which allows for this, and you need to have the logic which allows to do both plannings and calculation of the values in one central application. You should typically use the top-down for really a target setting, so define targets on a business unit, product, region level, cost center level, and then do the bottom-up planning with a lot of FP&A best practices. It's only doable to do this kind of combined approach if you really have implemented also best practices like driver-based planning and so on and so forth. Because if you really have to type in the bottom-up plan on a element by element level, it's extremely time intense, and there is a high risk that the people are getting lost with the details of the planning. So you need to reconcile both versions. This is a review process, which is extremely important. You need to run the iteration process to really align it, but you can only run the iteration process smoothly if you really have the transparency of both versions and the on-the-fly calculation. And you need the technology who really allows for both. You need to have a strong calculation engine where you can set up the model and the calculation of it. And then you need to have the speed in the calculation engine so that you really can produce the data and the outcome of the values on the fly instead of running a 1 day or 2 day process in the background. And you need to really use this, as I said, this central application to execute both at the same time and to combine the top-down and the bottom-up approach. So this was the last slide for today, and then I'm open the session or the webinar for the last minutes now for different kind of questions. So give me 1 minute and I will check the questions, and then I will come back to you. Okay, I'm back. The first question is around the business dimensions. Can a company define their own business dimensions for top-down and bottom-up planning? The answer is yes. How this concept of the fixed dimensions and the generic business dimensions, which I have explained before. Really, you have this concept of the generic business dimensions, and a company can define what is the key business dimension in the organization. And it can be a business unit, it can be a cost center, it can be a channel, whatever kind of business dimension is driving your business. And this then can be defined as key dimension for the top-down plan and or for the bottom-up plan. Good. The next one is, can a company add additional forecast methodologies or phasing methodologies? Yes, they can. It's Apliqo is a pre-built application which comes with a lot of already pre-built forecast methods, phasing methods, like we have seen before. The concept is there. And what we typically have during an implementation phase or before the implementation phase, we have workshops with the customers where they then can decide if all the pre-built methodologies are taking everything into consideration, or if they may have other methodologies and drivers. And then due to the fact that the concept is already there, we can add then the calculation logic, we can add an additional forecast methodologies, and then it will be in the same way available in the pick list, and in the calculation will be done on the fly in the same way like we have seen before in the modeling exercise. Okay, I hope this answers the question. Let me check another one. Okay, that's a good one. In the planning, I will summarize it. In the planning or in the demo, they saw that it was always the planning horizon was always 1 year, but quite often the target setting process and so on is longer than 1 year. And how is this taken into consideration? It's both doable. I mean, this was an example now for 1 year horizon, but obviously you can set the forecast methodologies, top-down targets, and value targets on a yearly base. So if you define it then, or if you want to plan a 3 or 5 year target, top-down target plan, then you can define this on a yearly base. You can roll over it so that if you don't want to type it in on a yearly base, you can roll over it as a default value, and then you can override the value and or the driver on a yearly base as well. Okay. Okay, there is one more question around performance. The values, or in the demo, they saw that the values were calculated on the fly, and if this is the only option, or if the data or the values or the forecast methods can also be pushed down via a process or whatever, and the answer is yes. I mean, both is doable. I mean, it has a strong power that a lot of stuff is calculated on the fly, where you have seen the power of changing a forecast methodology, changing an input value, and the immediately calculation of the outcome. So it is really a strong advantage during the whole planning process. But obviously, sometimes if you have massive planning data, sometimes it's also more or it's better to push it down via a process, and this is obviously also doable. And for example, the copy from the top-down target values and the forecast methodology into the bottom-up version, when this was not done with a calculation, this was done with a process which runs in the background. So both options are available and doable. Good. Is there another question? No, not really. So let me finish this with this slide. First of all, thank you very much for joining today's webinar. As I mentioned earlier, it was the next stop today, but more will come. And with the 2 URLs you see above, you have the ability to sign up for future webinars, and we will do more than just the 2 you see here on the screen. We will announce the others pretty soon, and then obviously I will share the slides later with all the audience, and then on the second URL you have the availability or ability also to check out this webinar, the recorded version, but also all the other webinars which we hosted in 2018. So once more, thank you very much for joining, and looking forward to your feedback. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us, and we are happy to help you on your path. Thanks a lot, and goodbye.